Hello everybody, I'm Tom Linsky. Most of you have seen our real-time sinking animation made to mark the 109th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. It was based on the book Odyssey of Glass by authors and friends of ours, J. Kent Layton, Tad Fitch, and Bill Wormstedt. And you're of course familiar with the amount of detail that has gone into the book and the subsequent animation based off of it. Using that animation as a basis, and further research since then, this video is the first of a series of micro-analyses of minute details that took place during the sinking of the Titanic, where we take it and we study it in as much detail as possible and tell the story surrounding it. We now present to you the story of Titanic's Lifeboat No. 2, one of her two emergency boats, the one on the port side. This is a story that had never been really told in its full. It had always been told broken up piecemeal among other stories of the night. As you watch this video, you may be surprised to find out just how much of an integral role that boat and the people on board had that night.
The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, and that was actually 4 more than the standing regulations required. But their capacity was only just over half the number who were actually on board that night. Now, even so, only 712 people survived the sinking, and that's actually far less than the 1,178 that her lifeboats were certified to carry. Among her other lifeboats, Titanic carried 2 of what were known as emergency boats. Each one was 25 feet 0 inches long and 7 feet 0 inches wide. Now, the Board of Trade said that each one of these 2 boats could carry 40 persons, but Harlan and Wolff, they used slightly different methods of calculation, and they thought that each one of these boats should only carry 33 persons each. These 2 craft, boats numbers 1 and 2, were actually the forwardmost lifeboats on the Olympic and the Titanic. They were located just beside the bridge. Typically, they were kept uncovered and swung out over the edge of the boat deck, and this was so that they could quickly be lowered in the case of an emergency, something like a man overboard scenario. Interestingly, during Titanic's departure at Southampton, both of these boats were actually cranked back in over the deck so that the captain, the officers, and the harbor pilot, George Boyer, could all see down the length of the hull from either bridge wing cab. Photos show that as the ship steamed down Southampton water toward the open sea, these boats were then cranked back out over the sides of the ship. A very famous photo that was taken on board Titanic on Thursday, the 11th of April, shows a woman looking over the port rail of the boat deck, and she's actually looking down at the tender America down below. But ahead of her, in the background of the picture, there's 4 lifeboats that were on that quarter of the deck. You can see them all in the picture, and because boat number 2 is swung out over the sea, it's actually visible in the distance in the photograph. Little did anyone know that that same boat number 2 was going to have such an enormous story that same Sunday night into Monday morning, the 14th to 15th of April.
In spite of the fact that your emergency boats were intended to be launched quickly in an emergency, boat number 2, located on the port side, actually ended up being one of the last boats to be loaded and launched. Steward James Johnstone, who was assigned to man this boat, was standing by waiting for work to commence there. Chief Officer Wild, who oversaw the loading of many of the boats on the port side, had last been seen at boat number 12, which had been lowered away at about 1:30 a.m. After that, he moved forward and took charge of loading boat number 2. Captain Smith was standing by the door of the wheelhouse, and Second Officer Lightoller was working at boat number 4, 1 deck below, and was apparently completely absent as Wild oversaw events at number 2 up on the boat deck.
Things got off to a bit of a rocky start with the loading of boat number 2. There was a number of crewmen, some said it was about 16 to 18 stokers, who snuck aboard the boat without permission. Passenger Mahala Douglas recalled Captain Smith shouting, "How many of the crew are in that boat? Get out of there, every man of you." And then passenger Elisabeth Allen recalled things a little bit more colorfully than that. She said that an officer, apparently Chief Officer Wild, came along and shouted to them, and this is a quote, "Get out, you damn cowards. I'd like to see every one of you overboard." Interlopers complied and got back out of the boat, after which the women and children nearby began to board. Mahala Douglas asked her husband Walter to join her in the boat, but he refused, responding, "No, I must be a gentleman." When he turned to face away, she advised him to stick by some of the other male passengers who were standing nearby, including Major Butt, the military advisor to the President of the United States, and Clarence Moore. As she said, both of them would surely make it. In the end, all 3 men perished. Meanwhile, third-class passenger Anton Kink saw his family into the boat, and he was asked to step back, but somehow he was able to sneak through into the boat at the last minute regardless. There's a number of passengers who survived in boat number 2 whose names are pretty well known to us today. Those include Minnie Cowitz and her 2 children. Also aboard were 29-year-old first-class passenger Miss Elisabeth Allen. She boarded the lifeboat with her aunt, Miss Elizabeth McMillan Robert, Mrs. Roberts' daughter Georgia Maddle, and Mrs. Roberts' maid Emily Croycian. All 4 women in the traveling party survived together in this one boat. Another traveling party was not so fortunate, while 2 sisters, Mrs. Appleton and Mrs. Cornell, made their way into this boat. They had become separated from their third sister, Mrs. Carolyn Burnell, and their friend Miss Edith Evans. Sadly, although Mrs. Brown made it into another boat, their friend Edith Evans did not, and she became one of the very few women from first class who perished in the disaster.
Finally, Lifeboat 2 was ready to leave the ship. Captain Smith, who was standing by, turned to Fourth Officer Boxhall, who was still on the bridge. Boxhall had been busy for much of the time, trying to contact the ship that was visible on the horizon. He was using the Morse lamps atop the bridge wings and firing rockets in a vain attempt to try to raise help from it. Captain Smith put Officer Boxhall in charge of this boat, as Boxhall would later describe to the BBC in 1962.
The captain came across the bridge and said, "Mr. Boxhall, you go away in that boat," pointing to the port emergency boat number 2. And he said, "Hurry up, Mr. Wilde is waiting to lower it." I tumbled into this lifeboat and we got lowered down.
There were only 17 or 18 on board boat number 2 total, out of a capacity of either 33 or 40 depending on how one counted. This is very interesting to us because the other emergency lifeboat, number 1, was launched from the starboard side much earlier in the sinking, around 1:05 a.m. It carried only 12 people out of its capacity for 33 or 40, and it's been the center of a major storm of controversy over the years. One passenger aboard, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, was publicly ostracized for having survived a disaster, and the reputation of he and his wife were all but ruined by the tragedy and the fact that they got off in a lifeboat that could carry so many more. Yet, here we have boat number 2, which was nearly as empty, and there's been virtually no controversy surrounding it at all over the years, not even regarding Mr. Kink, who climbed aboard despite having been ordered to step back. Mrs. Douglas heard Captain Smith call for his megaphone at about the same time that Mr. Boxhall was quote-unquote trying to get the boat off, and he called to the captain to tell him that there was a boat coming up over there. We know that the lowering process for this boat was not entirely smooth. According to saloon steward James Johnstone, who was there at the forward fall, the boat was told to lower to A deck, but then when they got there wasn't anybody there at all, so the boat was lowered away entirely. Although able-bodied seaman Frank Osmond said the boat went down very easy, very steady indeed, and that the gear worked all right, Boxhall later admitted that the lowering was very slow and that she wouldn't run until you helped with the falls. There's some contradictory evidence regarding how boat number 2 is released from its falls. Fourth Officer Boxhall is reported to have used a knife to help release the falls. That's as per Mahala Douglas's account. And Stewart Johnstone said he used a borrowed razor for the same purpose. When we first read these accounts, we thought that they cut the ropes, and then we started thinking about it, and we know that that could not be true because 20 minutes later, the same falls were used by Second Officer Lightoller to lower Collapsible D. It's possible that they used the razor and the knife to help pry free or slide the falls free from the boat once it reached the water rather than cutting the ropes. But it's interesting because you have 2 witnesses saying that they needed these to get released, but we know in any case they did not cut those ropes.
Boxhall tried to get organized and he quickly tried to take a head count, but because so many in the boat did not speak English, they never got above 10 and the effort was abandoned. Boxhall later estimated that he had 25 to 30 aboard, far higher than the 17 or 18 who were really in the craft. Boxhall also found that he was critically short in experienced manpower, having only one able-bodied seaman, Frank Osmond. Steward Johnstone and passenger Anton Kink also pulled oars. It would have not mattered too much, as Osmond later testified that the boat had only 4 oars. Boxhall later recalled he was standing up and pulling the stroke oar, while he had Mrs. Douglas take the tiller to steer the boat according to his orders. Some of the other women also assisted at the oars at various times.
Now, even though Boxhall testified that he pulled maybe 100 feet away from the ship and remained there for a while, he didn't remain there for very long, before he actually received new orders. Now, it was at this point that a very interesting event occurred. It was one that was reported by multiple eyewitnesses from at least 3 different locations.
This is the captain calling all boats. Return to the ship. Pull back, pull back, pull back to the ship.
Apparently, Captain Smith had earlier requested his megaphone. There were 2 that were supplied to the ship, and he got one of them. And he wanted to issue vocal orders to lifeboats that were already in the water. Back on the boat deck, first-class passenger Peter Daly, he remembered seeing Captain Smith look over the port side of the ship at some of the boats that were already in the water and shouting, "Bring those boats back, they're only half filled." In boat number 6, which wasn't very far off the port side of the ship at the time, Quartermaster Hitchens heard the whistle, and he had everyone stop rowing so that he could hear the orders that were being issued.
Pull back to the ship. Come around to the starboard side to bring aboard more passengers. Pull back. All boats, pull back. This is the captain. Pull back to the ship.
But when he heard the order to come back, he told the people in his boat, "No, we're not going back to the boat. It's our lives now, and not theirs." And he actually insisted on rowing further away. Boxhall remembered hearing an officer's whistle, and also overheard the order for some of the boats to come back again. This is the same order that Hitchens actually ignored. Now, even though he didn't identify Captain Smith by name in 1912, he did in a later interview. He also recalled seeing Captain Smith look over the port side and down at him, and this was clearly the same motion that Peter Daly was describing as he watched these events play out from back on the boat deck. Boxhall heard a specific order from the captain for him to go around to the starboard side, to the gangway doors, and unlike Hitchens in boat number 6, Boxhall wasted no time in complying, and that was the case even though those gangway doors were practically the opposite side to where he'd been lowered.
As his boat moved aft, Boxhall recalled that he had great difficulty getting the boat around there. In order to save time, he stuck close to the ship, particularly as he cut across the stern. The propellers were then cresting the surface of the water, which must have been quite a sight for those in the small boat.
When I passed round the boat to try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them.
Although this statement seems a bit exaggerated since the whole of Titanic's stern did not come out of the water until a bit later in the process, it does give some idea of what they were looking at just then. Boat number 2 rounded the stern and seems to have continued to move out from the starboard side as it traveled a short distance up the starboard side of Titanic. Boxhall was getting very nervous at this time because he felt that the boat was being sucked back in towards the ship, and he was also very nervous about being so close that the boat would be sucked in further.
How far forward the boat traveled on the starboard side is open to question because Boxhall gave 2 completely different accounts of what happened. In 1912, he said that he did not see an open gangway door and that he then moved away from the ship. Seaman Osmond recalled that they could not get to the starboard side because it was listing too far. Indeed, Titanic did have a strong list to port at the time, so it would have been difficult for the boat to approach a gangway door even if one was open. Interestingly, Boxhall's story completely changed 50 years later. While he had testified in 1912 that he saw no open gangway door and then abandoned the attempt, in 1962 he said that not only had he seen that gangway door open, but that there was such a mob standing in the gangway doors he dared not go alongside.
There was such a mob standing in the gangway doors, really, I daren't go alongside, because if they'd jumped they would have swamped the boat.
So was Boxhall telling the truth in 1962, or had time clouded his memory somewhat? It is an intriguing possibility to think that he might have abandoned the attempt despite a gangway door being open and crowded with people, but the basic fact is this. Considering the time that all of this was happening, it seems very likely that had Boxhall moved any closer to the ship in an attempt to take anyone else off, the boat would have been so close to the final sinking and breakup that it could have been damaged or swamped. Either way, it seems that Boxhall was very concerned about suction, that Osmond was concerned about the list of the ship, and that the women on the boat were very concerned about approaching too close to the Titanic, voicing these concerns to Boxhall and Osmond quite openly.
So what did Boxhall do next? He turned his boat to starboard, and he continued moving away from the ship in the afterly direction. How do we know this?
We know that Boxhall mistakenly believed that Titanic was still pointed west after the collision. He answered a leading question on that point in his testimony back in 1912, and he also reiterated the belief in a later interview. Now, we know that Boxhall was mistaken in that belief, and we know that Titanic had stopped with its bow pointed roughly north-northwest by the time she sank. We also know that the wreck of the bow points just slightly east of north today. And from model tank tests, it's also been analyzed and ascertained that as that bow descended to the sea floor, it would have tended to maintain the course that it had when it left the surface. So there's no question that Boxhall was wrong in his belief about the direction the Titanic was pointed. But knowing that Boxhall was off by about 90 degrees in his belief about which way the Titanic was pointed when she sank, we can also use this to tell what angle he rowed away from Titanic when he abandoned the attempt to take everyone off from the gangway door, whether that door was open or closed. Boxhall actually said that he turned away and pulled in a northeasterly direction. So if he believed the Titanic was pointed west, with her starboard side in the north and her port side in the south, then rowing in a northeasterly direction would mean that he steered his boat approximately at about a 45-degree angle off of Titanic's centerline, out and away and aft of her stern. Now, what's interesting is that the Carpathia is known to have been approaching the scene from the southeast. And again, if you mentally rotate things by about 90 degrees clockwise to account for Boxhall's mistaken belief on which way Titanic was pointed, this means that he was rowing roughly southeast. And because of that, it really isn't surprising that his was the first boat that the Carpathia encountered. In other words, he was rowing right in her direction.
The next question is, just how far did Officer Boxhall take Lifeboat No. 2 before the Titanic went down? And the answer is not quite as far as he thought he had.
Boxhall believed that he was a half-mile away from the ship when she sank, but this is quite impossible. We know the approximate time that the boat was lowered away. We know that it took time for the boat to row aft and around Titanic's stern. Their progress was admittedly slow because few knew how to row, and Osmond said there were only 4 oars aboard to begin with. While we were preparing our animation for the anniversary of the disaster, one of the things we learned is that most of the lifeboats actually had to be much closer to the ship than most of those on board thought they were. Survivors' accounts on this point varied widely from person to person, even within each boat, and there simply was not enough time for the boats to get very far away. This is especially the case with boat number 2, which was launched just before 1:45 a.m., only a half hour before the final plunge began. Once you add in the time it took to lower, cast off, row all the way around the stern, cross to the starboard side, move forward and out a bit so that Boxhall could see the gangway door in question, whether it was open or not, then turn away and start rowing off, our own estimates show that the boat really had been much closer than previously thought when the final plunge started at 2:15 a.m.
Now, considering how close they were to the ship, we don't actually have a lot of detailed accounts of what boat number 2's occupants saw as Titanic went down. Boxhall himself only admitted to seeing Titanic's lights go out, not to actually seeing her sink. Seaman Frank Osmond clearly recalled that the ship broke in halves. He also believed that the engines and everything that was in the stern slid into the forward part of the ship, and that the after part righted itself, but then went down again. Now, having done some tests with our animation, we don't actually think that Osmond could have seen the engines come out of the stern. They were just too low. However, what we do think he might have been seeing was the 2 towers of superstructure coming apart from the stern. In fact, the forward one slid into the sea, and that might have deceived him in what he was seeing. Well, Boxhall later estimated that they were a half mile or even a quarter mile away when the Titanic foundered. Osmond gave a far more likely estimate of just 60 to 100 yards distant from the ship. He even added that he thought that the sound of the explosions that he was hearing were actually the sound of Titanic's boilers bursting. Of course, we know that's not the case, but it is interesting to note what he thought those sounds were caused by. From this location, he described what the occupants of boat number 2 would have seen. After the ship exploded, as he put it, the stern fell back down, then climbed upright once more, but as soon as it did, it sank right down. Boxhall himself was perplexed that he couldn't see any other lifeboats in the water, and this actually led him to the mistaken conclusion that all of the boats that had been launched on the starboard side had rowed over to the port side, and that when he had rowed around to starboard, his boat was alone on that side of the ship. Now, of course, this doesn't explain why he couldn't see any of the boats that were supposedly on the port side after Titanic sank, and he could really see across where she had been in that direction. So quite simply, it seems that in turning to what we know was the southeast, Boxhall had just moved away from the other boats until he couldn't see them in the dark.
Sometime after the ship sank, Fourth Officer Boxhall began periodically lighting off green flares. He had brought a box of them with him from the bridge and put them in the boat during the loading in what he described as almost an afterthought, in the hopes that they would keep all the lifeboats together in the water. More than once during the night, occupants of other boats were fooled into believing that these flares were coming from an approaching ship. What's really sad about this is that there are reports that when Boxhall lit the first flare, the cries from those perishing in the icy water grew louder, probably because those individuals mistook the flares for a rescue ship. From time to time, Boxhall would have those at the oars stop rowing so they could hear the water lapping against the base of nearby icebergs. It was not long after Titanic sank that the officers on the Carpathia saw a green light in the distance, apparently one of Boxhall's flares. It appeared to be rather high up on the horizon, according to the witnesses. It made Captain Rostron and his officers hope that Titanic was still afloat, but they were wrong. However, the light was about a half point on Carpathia's port bow, and they steered towards it. Because of this, even though Boxhall was very much mistaken when he worked out the CQD position, which had been 13 miles west of Titanic's actual location, Boxhall was also responsible for helping ensure that the Carpathia made directly for the scene of the disaster, and particularly for those in the 2 damaged collapsible boats, bringing rescue nearer almost certainly saved their lives.
Shortly after 4 a.m., Rostron saw another one of those green flares, quite close this time. It was then that he realized it was from a lifeboat and not from Titanic herself. After dodging an iceberg that loomed up out of the darkness, Carpathia came to a stop, and Boxhall approached in boat number 2. Boxhall was at the tiller, and even then, Captain Rostron could see that they were having difficulty controlling the boat. Seeing some of the Carpathia's crew peering down from the bridge wing, Boxhall shouted up at them, "Shut down your engines and take us aboard. I have only one sailor." Just then, Mahala Douglas, who had left her husband behind in the Titanic, after which he had perished in the sinking, shouted, "Titanic has gone down with everyone on board." Boxhall brusquely told her to shut up, a rebuke which Mrs. Douglas minded, and later on admitted that she deserved. In due course, the boat came alongside Carpathia, and its human cargo offloaded to the Cunarder.
Boxhall was brought up to the Carpathia's bridge to speak to Captain Rostron, and it was actually from Boxhall that Rostron discovered the awful truth of what had really happened. And this must have been a really surreal scene for everyone that was there. Rostron asked him, he said, "Where's the Titanic?" And when Boxhall replied, it was reportedly with more than a touch of emotion. He said she was gone, that she sank at 2:20 a.m. And then there was this moment of stunned silence. It was the first confirmation that they had that Titanic really had sunk. And then Boxhall added in what was said to be a voice of desperation that Titanic had been hoodooed from the beginning. Now, Rostron was reportedly a pretty sensible guy, so he brought Boxhall back on track. He took him gently by the arm, and he said quietly, "Never mind that, my son." He said, "Tell me where all her boats got away safely." And Boxhall replied he thought so, but he did admit that it had been hard to see. He added that the ship had struck the berg at 11:40, and that the boats had been launched from about 12:45 a.m. onwards. As he continued to give details, Boxhall lamented that many of the boats had been lowered half full because no one that was in on the ship really believed that she was going to sink. Rostern asked him, were many people left on board when she sank? And this seemed to be the moment when Boxhall really broke down. He shouted in a voice that was crackling with emotion. He said, hundreds and hundreds, perhaps 1,000, perhaps more. And then he said, my God, sir, they've gone down with her. They couldn't live in this icy cold water. Boxhall added a few more details, and he actually included the fact that his own lifeboat had room for more than a dozen more people, but that they hadn't actually picked up any swimmers who'd been in the water.
Boat number 2 was among the boats that the Carpathia retrieved from the water and brought back to New York City, and it was photographed there at White Star's Pier 59 before it and all of the other recovered lifeboats disappeared from history and were lost forever. No one really knows what happened to Titanic's lifeboats after they were removed from the White Star Line pier in New York. Although Lifeboat number 2 didn't have one of the more notorious stories that night, it definitely had a very interesting one, and one that has never really been told in full. We hope you enjoyed this breakdown of Lifeboat number 2's tale and what they saw on board as the events of that night transpired. We hope to do this more in detail with other topics from the sinking, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you.